Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Business Links Africa. Our session on Face the Forum tonight. We are here with Mr. Michael Aduyobo, who is our host for tonight. We're going to be talking about information systems, security systems with information systems, and discuss anything that is in relation to systems architecture, system security, and how data is stored securely in our working environments. With us, our second moderator is Mr. Alphonsus Dumapo, who would also be asking a few questions, will be joining in with the session. And so welcome. And thanks for joining as well. Welcome, everyone. Mr. Aduyobo is the Managing Director for BPO USA, who has a complete career in consulting and working
good evening, guys.
Of governance, and so he's a seasoned IT professional. Very good session tonight. So apologies for any delays in this session tonight. Apologies for starting a bit late. We had a few technical glitches and travel plans, but we're back now live. Okay, Mr. Aduyobo, good evening and welcome to Business Links Africa.
Good evening and thanks for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your experience, and anything that will help us to understand your background a little bit more before we start the session?
Sure, thank you. So I have been in the workforce for about 27 years. Started as an IT person, did almost everything you can think of in the IT technical space. And then I transitioned into consulting and into management consulting more specifically after getting a business degree from Canada. And since then, I've been in the operational risk field, still in consulting, helping companies, clients as we call them, to reduce their technology and information related risks to a minimum. So that's what I do for a living. I'm based in Dallas, Texas, in the USA.
Excellent, thanks for that. So the first question from our members was, do you trust the security and privacy systems provided by the banks, institutions, or businesses in Africa?
That's a very good question. In the sense that trust is a relative term, and it depends on multiple factors, one of which is certainly the maturity of the organization, the value of investments into cybersecurity, into governance, risk compliance, etc., and resilience, and what I call the productive value of personnel that take care of these systems. And then, of course, you have standards, the value of standards and frameworks and targets that are set by different companies around security more broadly. So all of these have a contributing factor to whether one can trust businesses in Africa in terms of security. So I would say that it's really down to the maturity of each one of these things. And over here in the US, we have a lot of, I would say that there's a proliferated use of standards and frameworks and statutes and regulations and things like that. And despite all of that, we still have problems. As a matter of fact, we've had more security breaches in 2018 than any other year preceding it. So it's not an easy field to be in. It's not an easy challenge for companies. And so when you talk of Africa and considering that we're generally behind the so-called first world, this is a problem. And so I guess your guess is as good as mine in terms of how much one can trust security controls and security protection mechanisms in Africa.
Thanks. Thanks for your answer. It's quite a huge problem, or trusting the institutions that we rely on to provide services on our behalf. With regards to Cisco networks, what is Cisco networks and how is it used in today's organizations?
Sure. Cisco Networks is basically a company that is a big player in the networking space, the global computer networking environment. They provide a bunch of tools and systems that support internet networking worldwide, including the internet, and for some of the largest corporations we have in the world. They basically manufacture devices and appliances like routers and switches and VPN concentrators and things like that that support a lot of the functionality that we have with being able to move information around the world. So Cisco Networks is a key player, key vendor and provider in terms of internet networking from a global sense. There are other players like Juniper Networks and Palo Alto, which is out here in the US, that are also pretty strong and very popular among some of the largest corporations in the world.
Okay.
Yes. We're joined here by Alf. Have you got any questions in regards to?
So, what's Cisco got to do with CISO?
So, Cisco is a vendor, a provider of internet networking products and services. A CISO, which is a Chief Information Security Officer, is an executive role in an enterprise focused on protecting the enterprise's information, to put it in simple. Does that distinction help?
Yes, it does. It's just that you used Cisco in the answer to the previous question. I didn't think they were related in any way, shape, or form, apart from the fact that Cisco was a service provider and hardware provider of certain switches and hardware. So I didn't quite understand the link between Cisco and CISO, because CISO is an independent entity, presumably, for information system security officer, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I think the question, as I understood it, was what was Cisco Networks? So so that's why I went the route I took.
Okay.
Yeah, my apologies. I asked about Cisco Networks. That's probably why you misunderstood Mr. Adoyobo. I asked him specifically about Cisco Networks.
Okay.
That's probably why. So, in relation to talking about CISO now, we move to CISO questions. Can you tell us a bit more about what are the attributes, what attributes does a CISO need, basically?
Yeah, so a little bit of
what is a CISO in the first place?
Definitely, yeah. So a little bit of history. As recently as maybe the early to mid 90s, the CISO role or Chief Information Security Officer role did not exist. However, somewhere from the mid 90s and beyond, it's evolved very rapidly. It's become one of the most important jobs out there for across industries. And so we talk about the 21st century and we talk about digital transformation. The role of the CISO has evolved quite tremendously. Today, a CISO's role is one that combines strong technical as well as business skills, right? So you have a lot of technology underlying sort of, the responsibilities that a CISO deals with. Then you also have a lot of business implications that come out of some of the work that goes into security and governance and risk and compliance. And so the modern CISO is someone that is expected to have strong technical and business skills, one that is able to interpret technical issues in business terms, one that's able to foresee where a business is going strategically and come up with, some sort of a framework for managing risk and security from an information perspective in supporting the business's future goals and objectives. So it's become a very challenging role, and frankly, it's very difficult to find people that have both skills, or that are seasoned and very good with both skills. And so, there lies the value of a CISO today, and what the job entails. And then in the places like US, where you have a lot of regulation in certain industries like healthcare and financial services, insurance, consumer business, etc., the CISO's role is way more than just cybersecurity. It extends into governance, it extends into resilience, which is basically continuity management, recovery management. It gets into compliance from an IT standpoint, making sure that IT services are doing certain things to comply with certain regulations across industry. All of these are functions that in a mature environment, CISO would be responsible for. So that's in a nutshell what a CISO does in today's digital economy.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer. It's quite a broad answer, and it actually has you could see that it's got a broad spectrum. It works across various departments and across board in the business. So,
if I may ask the question, you said in the last Michael, you said in the last few years the CISO's role has not been limited to cybersecurity and stuff like that, but has expanded into higher management, probably obsolescence and various developments into the future. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example with, let's say, financial institution, right? So financial institutions in the US are very heavily regulated. And that means that they have certain mandates that they are supposed to comply with, usually with stringent deadlines. A lot of those mandates touch on security. For example, having someone accountable for security matters, having a security program enterprise-wide, having certain things in place in terms of access control and who can access what versus who cannot access what. All of those rules, in principle, are part of the function of managing security. But because of the spate of breaches in the across the world, these regulations have added more stringent controls to make sure that companies are following these. Right now, if you translate that into a company, the process of actually making sure that you have evidence to support compliance with a particular regulation can be very challenging, because remember, the core operational functions, it's very technical in nature. Doesn't really focus on laws per se or complying with mandates and stuff like that. So that added impetus makes it a little challenging for technical people, especially, to try to deal with compliance obligations. And a big part of the CISO's job is to translate those requirements into operational terms, into technical terms, so that the folks on the ground that work on these on a day-to-day basis have a good understanding of what to do to make sure the company is not at the risk of non-compliance. Because as we know, some of the penalties for non-compliance can be very challenging. For example, GDPR, which is a recent one from Europe, has some very hefty fines and things like that for just breaching a single person's personal information and the privacy around that information. So all of these are challenges that, when translated into a business environment, make the CISO's job a little difficult. And so it's one of those things where the CISO's job is beyond the norm. There's also a risk aspect to it that needs to be tackled in terms of potential non-compliance. And so one has to interpret all this stuff. One has to translate all this stuff into sense for a guy on the field that is, let's say a developer, or that is just a network monitoring analyst, for example, and what that means in terms of how that person does his job to make sure there's no risk to the organization. And that's all part of what the CISO's responsibility is about.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. If I might expand that a little bit, how you've talked about the States, you've talked about Europe with GDPR. You know where I'm going with the next question, don't you? How's it going to work in Ghana and Africa?
Well, it's a great question. Again, we talked about maturity of a bunch of different things. So one of the questions for places like Ghana and Africa at large is, what are our standards, right? I mean, you have regulatory bodies that are supposed to enforce these standards, and some of these exist, right? But some of the corruption and immature practices, bad practices, however you want to characterize those, make it difficult for the enforcement of these standards. And so that's one big problem. And then the other problem is just the skills and competencies of the people entrusted to actually protect these systems or the data, right? How good are they? Are they doing their job? Who is watching over them? Who is assessing the effectiveness of their day-to-day operations? All such weaknesses make it very, very, very challenging for places like Ghana to be able to meet these kinds of compliance obligations. But it's not as bad as it may seem to look. I think that there is some progress, even though there's a lot of work to be done. And we'll have to make sure that we're doing the right things in Ghana and in other places in Africa to make sure that compliance does not become a headache for the country, so to speak.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. So basically, we've touched base. We hear some funny noise on the screens, so I'm not sure where that noise is from. But hopefully we'll overcome that when it gets to the point. So do all organizations need a CISO?
Another great question. Eventually, that will be the norm because we are entering the digital age. There's a lot more information than there has always been. There's a lot more risk around information and where information goes these days. So the CISO's job is going to entrench itself. It's a good place to be for people in that field. Today, you don't have a situation where all enterprises have a CISO or even feel the need to have a CISO. And that's just a function of the maturity of your organization, right? So you talk about top tier markets, particularly the banks and the more mature financial institutions. That is not a problem. When you get to the middle market, you have situations where either the CISOs can't make sense of a lot of things, or they just don't have the good mix of business and technology skills to make things effective from a security and from a security perspective, so to speak. And then you have several of those companies in those markets that don't even have a CISO at all. I can give you a couple of examples of clients that I have today in the consulting world where they don't have CISOs. And in some cases, I've had to act in that role to give them some strategic direction on how to secure the environment because they just can't afford one, or they have previously been in in a type of business model where the role of the CISO has not been as apparent. But then you talk of digital transformation and you talk of migration into the cloud, which obviously comes with certain obligations and certain security expectations. And then suddenly an enterprise doesn't have anybody that's accountable for those types of questions and how to answer them. And so it drives a need for CISOs. And it's one of the big reasons why CISOs are very hard to find these days, in person and also in terms of skills and competence and experience.
Excellent. It seems a very new sort of area for the technical world, or the IT world, may I say. What do you think about that? Or what do you say about that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's new. I think it's just evolved, right? Because, going back to the mid to late 90s, we've come from just being able to automate, meaning computerized stuff, to the internet age where, applications have moved on from the desktop and server environment to more client server, to more web-based applications, and now we're getting into the mobile computing age, right? So everything is being ported to a mobile phone. To the point where the mobile phone is actually no longer a mobile phone, but it's a platform. And so that transformation, the purpose of that transformation is all about trying to get goods and services closer to a customer. And that means information, right? So today, if you are looking for something to buy, you have like Amazon, and you have a bunch of opportunities, a bunch of information to look into for options. Before Amazon, you didn't have that, and now you can do it from the comfort of your phone, whether you are in a mall sitting somewhere, or you're just hanging out enjoying some fresh air. Previously, you had to go to a computer to make that happen. So all of those transformations and how information is being distributed globally is also bringing risks around who has access to information, what they're doing with that information, where the information is sitting, et cetera, et cetera. And this creates much more work for CISOs. Hence the evolution that we've seen in terms of the role of a CISO between the mid-90s up until now.
Right. Thanks for that. That's quite an important aspect. Now, coming to more of the data aspects, the next question that we've had from our members is, are our data and personal information safe in the care of these organizations?
Great question. So to sort of build on what I just said about, digital transformation and where information is going, it's a great question, and I don't know if there's an answer to that question yet, but I would say that it's evolving. Why is there no answer to the question yet? Because I'll give you an example. You have a smartphone. You probably have an app, that sends information into the cloud. Do you know where that information is? Do you know where in the cloud it is? Do you know which part of the world that information is? Do you know who has access to it? Do you know what's being done with that information? Do you know what the marketing people are extracting by way of intelligence in terms of consumer behavior and what you're doing with that data? So all these questions raise concerns about information. And if I may just point to the recent Equifax breach, this is personal information for a lot of people that were affected, and that's out there, right? So that creates problems in terms of you and me and what we feel about our information just being out there, and that's a big challenge, right? And so the question of our data being safe and secure is relative. I think we can be fairly confident that these people that are now custodians or users of our personal information understand to some degree the value and sensitivity of that information to generally do the right things with that information. But every now and then, there's always some human failure somewhere that exposes this information to the bad guys. Not to mention there are just bad guys out there who make it their day-to-day job trying to get access to such information. So it's a bit of a a challenge, where we have to rely on others to keep our information safe. But I don't think there's any clear answer to whether we think we can be confident that our information is safe, if at all. Hopefully nothing happens. But this is a challenge of CISOs. This is a challenge of enterprises in trying to make cybersecurity a priority. And I can tell you that this is a big discussion in the boardrooms lately. It is companies are struggling to make sense of that. And one of the challenges with that is, you have business people that don't understand the technology, and then you have technical people that cannot interpret the technical issues in business terms. So it's just an ongoing battle. But ultimately, I'm not trying to put fear in all of us. I'm just trying to say that the answer is not clear cut, and we can rest assured to some degree that mostly people are doing the right things, but there's always some risk somewhere, and this is where CISOs have a big responsibility to reduce that risk to the barest minimum.
Excellent.
How?
Question?
Sorry, can you hear me? I'll just get you.
Yeah.
How do you mitigate that risk that you just spoke about? Because obviously, this technology, talking business, obviously budgets versus security. How do you mitigate for that?
Sure. So, this is where the value of a CISO is very, very important, right? So the first thing I would say is that if you are in a position of trust and responsibility at an executive level, overseeing security of an enterprise's information, the first thing you really need to do is to understand the environment in which you are. I like to use the analogy of a wallet. If you know what's in your wallet,
physical or technical?
Day-to-day life example has that.
Okay.
Yeah, but to sort of wrap up, if
you know what's in your wallet, sorry.
If you think there's something valuable in your wallet, you tend to keep it somewhere safe. Same way, if you understand the value and information, the value and sensitivity of information in an enterprise, you tend to have a clear strategy on how you want to protect that. The challenge with most companies is that they don't understand the value and sensitivity of their information. They just take it as this is company data. So for that reason, they don't understand the risks of unauthorized access to such information. And this is why breaches have become such a pain, because like in the case of Equifax, nobody expected that there will be, lawsuits almost 10 times the value of the compression, or they'll be in the news to such a degree where some executives would have to go answer to the press and stuff like that. So first thing is to really understand the value of information and the sensitivity of that. The second thing is to know what is required to protect that information against unauthorized access, understanding the potential impacts that could result from that. Then the third thing is implementing the types of controls and mechanisms to secure that information and make it very hard for the bad actors to get access to. And then the fourth and probably most important thing is the people that are associated with that information, the people that use the information, create it, transact business with it, etc. Do those people understand their job roles and the security responsibilities associated with those job roles to even act in a way that adds some layer of security protection to that information? That's another big challenge, right? So the solution to the problem, I think, is looking at all of those four things. But it is not easy because, especially on the people side, you're trying to change the way people behave, and it's not an easy thing. But that seems to be, in theory, the way to address the problem, and it takes time. And in terms of selling that in an organization, you have to be able to put all that in terms of business impact and business value to the board and C-suite so that they can support it. Because many a time the problem we have is that they don't understand it because you're not technical people. When you say that you don't have a strong enough router to act as a first line defense for your network, well, what does that mean to the CFO if he doesn't understand the language, right? Or what does that mean to a board member that's not technical? So that kind of technical problem must be interpreted in business terms for a business person to understand. Then they can lend support to IT people to then make the necessary investments to protect that information. So that's, to me, that's the way forward in solving the problem.
So the bottom person on the chain, i.e., the person who takes his mobile phone into work, as we've been seeing on certain platforms on WhatsApp and stuff like that, and we've been having documents circulated which say secret document, and then it goes viral. This obviously should be avoided. So I think what you're saying is, from the person on the ground, probably, if no disrespect, from the cleaner up to the CEO, everybody's got to be careful with the data that they're, shall we say, privy to.
That's absolutely correct. And you know, a very famous hacker, I think I forget his name, but I can find that and put that out. But he said that companies spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on equipment and security tools and devices and stuff like that. But none of that is tied to the weakest link in security, which is the people, right? So you talk about a janitor. You know, he has a job that gives him access to physical areas. Well, what's the sensitivity of those physical areas? What's in those physical areas that necessitate some sort of protection to someone like a janitor that has access, right? And unless a business or the CISO and his team understand that, there's no way they're likely to pay attention to the physical security, which then exposes information to the janitor, and then what help the company in terms of what the janitor can do with that. But the broader point I'm making is that in any enterprise, you have people with roles and responsibilities. Those are wide and varied, right? The executive's responsibility is certainly different from the line manager's responsibility or the field person's responsibility or the janitor's responsibility. So from an enterprise viewpoint, one must understand the security responsibilities related to the job, and then build a security program that addresses these security requirements by job role, and then train people accordingly to exercise that job role, being mindful and aware of their security responsibilities. That's the best chance of not having the situation that you just described, in terms of, you know, people just thinking they're doing stuff on the phone, and before you see, information is viral. So the people piece is very, very important, and we all have responsibilities in our work areas, in our homes, you know, things that we might take for granted. We need to pay attention to the security around the things we do, and I think that will start to shape behaviors that make it increasingly harder for the bad guys to get access to information they don't need to get access to.
Excellent. That seems very thorough. Cleaning up for most organizations. I suppose these are for all organizations, but even so more for the sensitive organizations. That leads us to the next question from our audience, which is, how reliable is the IT services provided by organizations and businesses in Africa?
So another interesting question. I think it's similar to the previous question that was asked. You know, so when you talk of reliability of IT services, you talk of value of IT to the business, and then you talk of the the value of investments in IT itself. And when I say value of investment, it's not just the servers and the technology, you know, or leveraging cloud to cloud environments and platforms and so on. It's the processes around all of that. It's the people around all of that. It's the technology itself. It's the third-party vendors and service providers around all of that, right? Each one of those have a role to play in terms of the value of IT services. So the question really is, do we have clear standards? Like, do we have a bar that we set for all of these stakeholders to play their roles in ways that maximize the value of IT in an environment? This is a big challenge for IT departments worldwide, right? So you think of the so-called first world, like the Americas and the UKs, etc., and where they are, and then you try to translate that to places like Africa, where we are by and large followers, adopters. We're not innovators by and large. So we're kind of following the crowd, so to speak. And so if the first world is dealing with these kinds of challenges, you can imagine what we may be dealing with in Africa with as being followers, right? And we're behind. So by the time we figure out that a certain piece of innovation has some major risks associated with it, we will be adopting it before we even realize that there's a risk, right? So I'm not saying this to sort of belittle or shut down hopes and sort of the potential of Africa. I'm just saying that maybe if we change our mindset to a little bit more of innovators, maybe we can spot some of these things before we even adopt them, which helps our IT services become more reliable. But as it is now, I mean, I'll take Ghana as an example, and Ghana is one of the leaders in Africa when it comes to technology. As a matter of fact, we don't have strong technology infrastructure. I mean, it's good, but it's not as strong. And so this is the infrastructure being leveraged by a lot of businesses. I'm talking about, communication platforms, telecom platforms. I'm talking about data transmission. I'm talking about, encryption and those types of technologies. What are our standards around that? Do we follow them? And so when you look at all that, your guess is as good as mine in terms of whether IT services are reliable. But I think that we know that the opportunity is there, and we know that there is, it's not like nothing is being done, but we're just behind. And the earlier we can start innovating to get us to catch up quickly, the better we can rely on the local services, IT services to benefit our businesses.
Okay. Can I just go back actually, because there was something in news last week on the Marriott hotel chain, with the security breach, where up to 5 million guests in quote, probably on their database, got breached. How does that fit into our daily life? And do you know whether they have a CISO?
I would like to think that Marriott has a CISO. I don't know for sure, but Marriott is one of the largest
hotel chains
in the world right now. I know several hotel chains that don't have CISOs. I don't know specifically for Marriott, but I would hope that they do have, because of their size and the complexity of information that they deal with on a day-to-day basis along, in terms of their individual brands. And then of course they just merged with the Starwood group as well. So there might be some integration risks that may not have been accounted for that type of cybersecurity. I don't know. But ultimately, this is where people like you and I have to be concerned, because we use these hotels, we have our names on there. There are records that are kept for a certain period. But again, talking about all the things that we've talked about in terms of the CISO's job and how difficult it is, how does that sit with hotel chains in general? Like, how does Marriott compare with, let's say, a Bank of America? I can't tell you how many times, in the consulting world, I go out and a client says to me, "Oh, but we're not a bank, so we're not going to do that." Well, are you modeling your business on what a bank does, or you're modeling a business because you understand your risks, right? So these are some challenges that companies face, and depending on who has that CISO role, if they have one, and what they see, or how their skills and competencies fit with some of the things that we've talked about in terms of understanding the business, knowing what the crown jewels are, knowing the value of those crown jewels and how to protect them. Everything else is just like, routine. And the bad guys are out there. So you give them the chance, they'll take it. And then I come back to the point of awareness and training, right? The CISO or whoever is in charge of security may be doing the right things, but it takes one person that lacks that awareness,
send an email
to open the door for the bad guy to take advantage. So this is a very complex thing, and we can't be 100%, confident that everything is good. But we can all take little steps to make sure that when our information gets into other people's, protected, right? So it will be nice, for example, to go to, checking into a hotel and not just give them your credit card and your ID to sort of check you in and all that, but to ask some questions about the security of the information you just provided and be satisfied that that information is secure. How many of us do that? Probably less than 1%, if any at all. So it's a shared responsibility for all of us to make sure that these kinds of issues don't happen. But clearly, Marriott has a lot of work to do with what just happened, because that number of records in a hotel chain is pretty bad. It's pretty bad, and maybe they'll be on my first people to call tomorrow to see if they can give me business.
Excellent. I think it's pretty obvious how important a CISO role is, and basically moving into even more advanced technological and innovative ideas and things being implemented. For example, the AI systems, artificial intelligence, systems,
Yeah.
these new developments coming up. But we come back to
and
those.
if I may, if I may add a technical question. I know pen testing, penetration testing is pretty hot on the list at the moment. It's a hot topic around the world in terms of cybersecurity and AI. And I know it's also, depending on what level of pen testing you do, it can be stupidly expensive. I'm presuming that features in how obviously the board of companies determine whether or not whether it's single sign-on or double sign-on or that kind of stuff, what kind of passwords you use and how often you change your passwords and what the combinations of alphanumeric characters are. How does that fit into the whole mix?
Yeah, so penetration testing is a good practice, but remember that it is entirely designed to focus on configuration weaknesses, system configuration weaknesses. So the result of a pen test basically is how strong or how weak your configuration, your security configuration is, and whether that can be exploited by a bad actor, an authorized person, right? It doesn't touch the people side. It doesn't touch the process side and all the other pieces that could open the door for bad actors, right? So whilst pen test is a good thing to do, it is only, to the hacker's earlier point, it's not the weakest link in the security chain. So, you can secure the systems, but you always have to pay attention to all the processing that happens around
processing chain.
These activities and the technology, right? And the passwords and all of those controls that exist, and probably pay more attention to the people, because again, you can put all the, security gates and locks and whatever you want to call them. It takes one person to open the door, and then that is all nonsense, right? So it's very important that people in security, people that are in the risk management role, and that includes auditors, that includes enterprise risk practitioners, right? When you're looking at security from whatever perspective, the more holistic they look at security, the better. You can't just focus on technology and think that everything is going to be okay. Because it's not actually the weakest link, it's the people. So we have to spend a lot more time educating people. We have to spend a lot more time making sure people are doing what is expected of them in the business environment. And we have to spend more time, doing continuous improvement type activities so that we can say over time, we're raising the bar in terms of how secure an enterprise is.
Thanks. Over to you.
Excellent. Now that comes to my famous question about my famous country, Ghana. Now, the reason why is because of these concerns that you've raised in terms of security breaches, risks involved. Is, in your estimation, how secure are the banking and financial systems in Ghana?
Another great question. I think that we should, so if I were to estimate, I'll probably put it somewhere around 40 to 50%, and maybe that's a little generous. Why? Because of everything we've talked about, right? Start with the core infrastructure. Our backbone in Ghana. What's our internet backbone in Ghana, really? Like, what's that? Who's that? Do we know? Right? There are providers, but which of them is actually the backbone of digital transformation in the economy? I don't know the answer to that, right? But we know that there are providers out there. So you start there, and then you talk about companies in Ghana, that rely on these platforms, these backbones that are not so much where they are supposed to be. And then you talk about standards. What is our standard for encryption? What is our standard for data transfer? Our standards for data storage? Our transfer for exchanging data between business entities? Our standards for how people use data? Do we have them or we don't have them? And even if we had them, I'm wondering if those are effective. So there's a lot of, I think that I don't mean to digress here, but I think one of the biggest ways to solve the economic problems of Africa is to be really clear about our standards and enforce them, right? In some cases we have them, but we don't enforce them, and then there's the corruption and all of those things. So you put all that together, and then you look at like a Ghana commercial bank, right? What kind of platform do they depend on? What are their systems? Are they secure? Who built them? Did they think of security when they were building the systems? Who's using them? Are there weak points in the whole sort of life cycle of data transactions across the country? So for example, when you transfer money electronically, who are the players in the middle? What's the platform? Is that susceptible to some sort of interception by a middleman? I think we should count ourselves a bit lucky, because generally places like Ghana may not be a prime target for some of the world's most dangerous hackers. But there is certainly a concern about the value of all of these pieces that I just mentioned, the value of the core infrastructure, the value of applications in use, the value of the people that work around these applications, the oversight and governance around all of that. And so therein lies the problem with security of information, but we haven't had any major stories, but we can't take that for granted, right? I think that as a third world country, we are where we are, but ultimately we need to start thinking. We need to start innovating. We need to start moving beyond just being adopters and start to think about, why are we even buying this technology, right? Is this value for us? We should be asking those questions, right? Why are we making this investment in technology? Or why are we using this backbone? Or why are we using that platform? What's the value? What's the risk? I think the more we do that, the more we have enough information and opportunity to make the best decisions in terms of securing data in Ghana and elsewhere. But today, I'm a bit skeptical. So maybe the 40 to 50% is a bit generous, but that's where I would put it in general.
You might want to ask Danny Jampo a few questions on.
He might shoot that down.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, he would have been, if he had been on board, it would have been a good question for him. We're wishing that hopefully later on we might come across some of our IT analysts and directors who are working in the banking field, just to give us a bit more information about how they go about their daily work, the challenges they've had, and how they've managed these challenges. It'd be interesting to know. My main question then is, are there any regulatory bodies that ensures that financial institutions have reliable systems for data transactions and safe storage? Is there any regulatory bodies in Africa, for example?
I think there are, maybe not enough. But let me share some perspectives, right? So again, the so-called first world, right? Like in the US, we have a lot of regulations. We have a lot of statutes and mandates. Some of them industry, some of them government, some of them just even state level. And whilst these are all intended to force businesses and enterprises, for that matter, to focus on security, well, we have the most security breaches in a calendar year ever in 2018, right? So that tells you the enormity of the problem. Regulations and statutes help, but they are not exactly the answer. So I look back at Ghana, for example. I think that there are bodies and committees, national level, government appointed committees and things like that that are supposed to be regulators on some of these things. But the question always is, who even knows what standards they have, if at all? How many people follow them? And how do they even check and ensure that companies are complying with those? To me, that's where our weakest points are. So I wouldn't be surprised that there are probably more regulatory bodies formed, but they're just not effective. And so stuff happens, and you wonder, what's going on here? What's the role of the government here? Why did they even set up the committee? But I think the bigger point to make is that they help. They sort of show the intent of government, but there's no value to setting all of that stuff up and not mandating enforcement of those standards. And for those areas where standards don't exist, I think you want to set some standards. So I mean, you look at the Ghanaian economy. I think the financial sector needs serious regulation. There's probably some regulation, but who enforces it? Who follows it? I don't know if anybody can answer that question today, but I do know that there are, auditors and audit institutions and things like that that are helping to put some of these checks and balances in place. But I don't think it is all fully effective. I think we need more. I think we need more emphasis driven by leadership to say this is an important aspect of our national development. We need to spend some time to create some standards, set a bar for us as a nation to aspire to that bar, and let all companies follow it. So it's, again, potential is there, but we have to change our mindset, our leadership attitudes, things like that, to make sure that there is value, there's effect from all of these well-intended bodies and regulations and things like that that are out there.
On the assumption that there are regulations, obviously you're comparing the West to the third world countries, like for instance Ghana, who is one of the South Africa and Ghana, some of the guys in the forefront, especially with these ID cards and all this kind of stuff that we spoke about probably last week, a couple of weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago. How is it, because the key thing really is enforcement, how is it enforced in the West, both at a company level and probably presumably training of individuals within the company down to the lowest common denominator?
So that's so that's a good question, right? I think the ability to enforce depends on the approach and methodology being used to identify a person, right? So in the US, the moment you're born, if you're born here, that is, you are assigned a social security number. If you are an immigrant and you come in and you go through the system, you are assigned a social security member and a number, and that number identifies you. Plus that, right? You have to ask the question, how does that compare with having an ID card with a number? I think the advantages and disadvantages are obvious. But then the other thing too is that there are other ways of identifying people. For example, here your number plate identifies you. So it's an added piece of information on top of your social security number. And all it takes is a simple match between a number plate and the individual associated with that, with a national database on social security numbers to see if someone is legitimate or not. See, that kind of opportunity comes with that kind of a methodology. When you go to Ghana, so you look at ID cards. Well, think of the guy in Konongo Chrome that has an ID card that's probably going to lose it in a week, right? And then think of, if it's all computerized, think of the platform on which that computer information sits. Think of the management of all of that information. Think of who takes accountability for making sure that is up to date, is current, because of the rate of our population growth, all of that is reliable. So these are pertinent questions. And so whilst the intent of the national ID card is great, there's a lot of questions around the viability of such a system in identifying as a person and being able to integrate that person into all spheres of life, whether the person is a consumer, whether the person is a criminal or someone of value for the economy, right? So to answer your question, I personally think that we need to rethink what we really want to do when we say we're implementing a national ID system, right? Because we have a slightly different circumstance from the US or the so-called first world. And we have to rethink what we need specifically in a national ID system and then set the bar and then go with that and make sure that we have actually also thought about the sustainability of such a system. Because that is really the lesson to learn from the likes of US and UK and other places where these are more mature, right? And so, I mean, the question I would ask is, why aren't we learning from these people that have been there and done that? What's the single simplest common denominator to identify a person? You can start with a lot of things. There's some information available. You can start from somewhere, but we have to think of the after fact in terms of what we do with the information, how we sustain the information, keep it current. Thinking about all the people that in the villages that have kids that don't go through a hospital system where they can be registered, for example, or people that infiltrate the system or even immigrate to the country. Like, where's all that information? So it's not an easy fix, but I think we need to be. I think if we give ourselves a chance to be creative, to be innovative, we will find solutions to this problem. The challenge is we come up with a lot of ideas and the implementation is so poor that the idea dies before it even yields dividend. I can give you examples from Operation Feed Yourself to you name it, right? So the value of information today is very critical for national development, and the security of that information is also a big part of it. So we, those of us from Ghana and other places, we need to stop being just adopters and start to be innovators, really, and start making some good value from what we have and create systems that meet our local circumstances and help us develop. Because there's just so many benefits from a national ID system. The question is if we will do it right and we'll understand what it takes to actually sustain it and keep it long term.
Okay. I think this question is a decoration of a donkey, so to speak, because I think you may have answered it in answering another question for the forum, which is, what's the role of Bank of Ghana, and do they mandate standards for financial institutions? Yeah, I don't know whether you're aware of the answer or not, because I don't know whether you know anything about the Bank of Ghana.
Well, what I know is that from a financial practices standpoint, there are regulations that they do fairly well to try to um, enforce. So if you may have heard recently, some banks were being recapitalized and things like that. That is all, those are examples of some of the regulations that Bank of Ghana has. I don't know specifically if they have any regulations around cybersecurity, um, or the protection of financial information. I would like to believe that it's there, but I don't know the extent to which it's enforced, because I mean you can't. It's been a while since financial transactions went electronic. I mean, we've been dealing with SWIFT for several years. There are a lot of actually third-party platforms for money transfers these days, with Wave and Cash App and some of those types of apps, right? Uh, you know, World Remit and all those types of companies. And so I would like to believe that the Bank of Ghana has some standards around how these third-party providers play in the system, and or influence how things happen. The movement of money between elsewhere in Ghana, which would presuppose that there must be some standards around the security of information with those types of transactions. But the extent to which that is enforced, I don't know. But it comes to the question of standards again. I mean, you want the Bank of Ghana or whichever uh, body it is to be very clear with what those standards are, publish them, make sure they are known, hold banking institutions accountable, and punish them when they flout the regulations, to bring some sort of order and sanity to how information is protected for you and I as customers of those institutions.
Okay. Talking about regulations and stuff like that, I'm seeing that since being a CISO is quite a, shall we say, intensive thing, are there any say organizations? I mean, in systems engineering, we have organizations of systems engineers. In acoustics, we have acoustics organization of acoustic engineers. Is there a CISO kind of organization, or international organizations where you can tackle things and everybody can have a say as to what's happening, provide lessons learned, best practices, and stuff like that, so that there's a resource for people to go to and say, okay, at least I don't have a CISO here, but this is my first starting point. And if I need to, say, hire somebody, at least I can get a recommendation from this organization of mutually appreciative personnel.
So, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there is such an organization for CISOs as you would have for like professional engineers, right? I don't think there's one. And I think the reason for that is, again, this is such a challenging role that's evolving so fast. I mean, we're literally talking about what, 23 years um, in the life of the longest serving CISO, 23 to 25 years thereabouts, in which a lot has changed. I mean, when I started working, Windows didn't exist, right? We were doing MS-DOS and stuff like that, right? So think of how far that has come from, the personal computer to servers to, all the way through to the internet and using web apps and now mobile devices and what all of that means. I think the evolution is so proliferated that people are struggling to keep up with what is required, and people are frankly struggling to even learn about, there are people that are CISOs today that just are lost, need help with what to do. So that's probably one of the reasons why we don't have that kind of organization there. However, there are special interest groups and associations that, standards associations and so on that have standards. more around security, not specific to the CISO and the role of a CISO, but more around managing security. So some examples will be ISO 27001 /2, which is an ISO standard for cybersecurity. The National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the US has a bunch of publications. They call them standards and publications that touch on cybersecurity. We have the Information Security Forum that has some standards. We have the Cloud Security group that also has some standards around security in the cloud. There's a whole bunch of them. As a matter of fact, the Information Systems Audit and Control Association worldwide has a tool called COBIT that has a whole section devoted to cybersecurity. So there are all of these resources, best practices, framework standards that publish best practices around how security should be managed. And it covers various aspects of security, from governance to access control to disaster recovery to vulnerability management, threat management, incident response, et cetera, right? That can be helpful for people in a CISO role or security practitioners at large to leverage and use to support the work that they do in securing environments. And so lately, you see companies are starting to, of course, the regulated ones, they don't have a choice because they are slapped with a regulation, they must comply. But you have some of the more forward-looking companies adopting some of these standards that I just mentioned as a means of, having access to some set of best practices to set a bar for how they would manage security. And then you have some other organizations, just by virtue of their business model, use a hybrid version of some of these, or a combined version of some of these to set a bar. So it comes back to the point I made earlier on about, the best way, the first most important thing about security is knowing what you have and the value of what you have. Because if you know that, then you tend to go look for the things that help you secure those. And that's the big problem with a lot of companies. They spend a lot of money, but if you ask them what are their crown jewels, they can't tell you what that is. They tell you what they think is important, but they can't tell you that this type of information is so sensitive that if we don't put certain controls to it, this will cost us X million dollars in penalties, or we'll lose our top 5 customers, or that kind of impact, right? That's interpreting technical things in business terms, which makes sense to a CFO or someone on the board. So it's still an evolving thing, and I hope that we can set one up somehow. But as a short-term measure, there are these standards and frameworks. I would also say that on LinkedIn, there are groups that bring CISOs together and people connected with security. And that's also a place where, for collaboration and things like that, for ideas in terms of how to secure one's environment.
Okay.
Excellent.
Danny has just come online. Why am I echoing? Okay. Danny has just come online and said Bank of Ghana has recently released cybersecurity directives. There are a few steps behind industry and really need to build up capacity for enforcement. Enforcement will be the game changer. All frameworks and standards already exist and they can be adopted. So there's confirmation for you from the inside the bank knowledge.
Exactly as I thought. So again, it sounds like they are there, but the big thing is enforcement and putting this out and making sure they are known and that the government takes this seriously, or the Bank of Ghana takes this seriously, and that's the big thing. So yeah, we have work to do, obviously.
Which comes to a related question from the forum, which is where was it? Government enforcement and training of individuals in Ghana. I can't see that happening personally, but okay.
That's a tough one. I think we know the answer to that. But again, I don't, I don't want to be accused of making too much of a comparison between places like US and Ghana.
Yes, and
The thing is that if we're going to learn, if we're going to do things right, one of the things we can do is to learn from people that have been there, done that. And I can tell you that enforcement is not easy, even here in the first world. You know, I mean, Equifax was compliant. You know, it's a financial institution, somewhat. They have regulations they have to follow. They have met all their regulatory, but it was still breached, right? That goes for a lot of the big companies that have been in the news about security breaches. Amazon, CNN, etc. You know, Home Depot, you name them, right? Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, they've all been compliant. So one of the big revelations from these experiences is that compliance does not equate security. You know, you can comply with a regulation or a standard that is focused on security, but that does not make you secure. Because with compliance, what you have to do is basically show evidence that you've done something. Well, what about tomorrow? Right? So it's a point in time validation that anybody can pass. But if someone shifts, you know, the bar from where it's supposed to be to somewhere lower, well, you just broke the rule, and that can be exploited. So one of the things we always put out there is that you can't just assume that by complying with a regulation you are secure. You have to focus on the basics, which is understand what the value of the information you have, understand the sensitivity of that information, the risk of unauthorized access to that information to a business, and then start to come up with a strategy for protecting that in commensurate ways. And so imagine that happening here in the first world, and then compare that to Ghana, where, to Danny's earlier point, you know, the rules are there. Bank of Ghana has just released something, but now it's time for implementation, and it's time for enforcement, and it's time for adoption. Who is going to oversee all of that? You know, and I don't think companies want to spend money unless they are forced to actually spend the money, because it's not core to their business. You know, I mean, a bank's core business is not regulations and cybersecurity. It's about money and transactions. So if they don't have to spend money for some mandate, they'll do what they think they have to do to make their money. But if there is enforcement, there is a mandate from the government, and there's, you know, accountability for that, I think you'll start to see that even before newcomers come into the economy for those types of services, they must have their act together before they can get in. I mean, we need to do these things to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, right? But we're just so much following without even thinking beyond why we're doing what we're doing. And there's so many good ideas out there, well intended, but poor implementation is killing us. So that's
as you say, we've got to be more proactive than reactive, because at the moment we're just being reactive and reactive and reactive. But it's not only Africa; it's also the first world, because here, unless there's a security breach, and even in the Kaspersky's and virus scans of the world, the only thing they can do really is react, apart from trying to build more secure software. And now I think guys like Microsoft and Cisco and Unix and stuff like that, they're all building software such that, okay, I'll put the trial out there and see who can hack it, and then use the test results from the hacking to solve the problems of security, because they don't have the resources, presumably, to make sure that it's unhackable in the first instance, which is why the beta versions and the alpha versions are out there.
And that's a good point. The main thing is technology, right? There's too much emphasis on technology sometimes. And that's not the weakest link. You know, it doesn't matter what kind of Jericho wall one builds until someone just pokes a small hole in it. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, these discussions are really mind-boggling in terms of how much it can, a business, company, organization, banking, or financial institutions that we rely on so much can easily be affected if there's any security breach. That comes to our question from a member of Business Links, which is an important one. Very simple question, but it's hopefully going to make us understand more, those of us who are not so technically involved in the everyday affairs of the organizations. What is cybersecurity?
Sure. So, in very simple terms, cybersecurity refers to the protection of electronic data, period. Slightly different from the broader term security, which can go a variety of ways, such as security of a facility, or security of an item, right? An item like a car. But cybersecurity is purely focused on electronic data, which today sits with a lot of, a lot of entities and actions and items and processes and things like that that leverage the internet as a platform. So when you talk of security in terms of electronic records, that's what cybersecurity is.
And how does an institution recover when their security is breached by such an attack?
That depends on what actually caused the breach, right? But in principle, the first thing to do when a breach happens is to isolate the affected computers, right? Why? Because depending on the nature and design of the breach causing agent, the impact of the breach can spread. So an organization's ability to quickly spot and detect what is happening and isolate affected computers is the first thing. Then you have to figure out the root cause of that breach. What actually happened? Is it some sort of ransomware? Is it some sort of denial of service attack? Is it a man in the middle attack? Is it something based on phishing, which is basically someone clicking on a link that was supposedly that was interpreted as a legitimate link, but was actually a bad link that opened a kind of worm, so to speak, right? So those details determine how much goes into the actual response. But again, in principle, once you've isolated the affected machines, then you want to apply the appropriate tools, security tools, and there are lots of them out there to fix the root cause, right? Now, sometimes that's not so easy to do. Particularly with ransomware attacks, they can basically hold you hostage, and you have to pay money to then be freed. And it's not small money. Yeah, it can be millions. There was a recent case with some massive Bitcoin value. I forget what the exact value was, but that can happen, right? So there are different types of breaches, but other than ransomware and denial of service type attacks, where it can be challenging, most of the other sort of Trojans and worms and things like that can be isolated and treated with most recent versions of cybersecurity, threat management tools. Not just antivirus. These days, you're building antivirus to include more of that, but there are specialized tools for specialized types of breaches. And in some scenarios, breaches have happened where the vendor involved had to come up with a quick fix, like in a matter of days. And that quick fix is then made available for downloads for IT people to fix as necessary. So the dynamics can be very, very wide. But ultimately, you isolate the affected machines, you clean them up. And one thing I always recommend is to validate the success of the cleanup. Right? You can't just run a tool and the tool says everything is done and you think that that's it. You have to validate it. And that means going through some test processes and making sure that there isn't a further propagation of a virus or whatever the breach agent is before you restore those systems back online. So that's sort of the general flow. But as I said, depending on what it is, it can be very, very challenging. fix and very difficult. And sometimes you just have to bite the bullet until you can find a solution. But the good news is there are companies out there that have made their life mission to fix these types of problems. So we're never short of tools. We're never short of people that have incident response capability for cybersecurity breaches, but they're expensive and they charge you a premium, especially when you're breached. And then if you're not breached, they'll ask you to pay a retainer for services as needed. But you can be paying that retainer for 5 years and not need their services, so it's just money going down the drain, and it's a bit of a rock and a hard place, right? So it's it's challenging, but these are reasons why you don't want to be in that kind of situation, and you want to be more proactive in securing your environment to make it harder and harder for bad actors to cause breaches in it.
The company you're looking for was Nyala, the hosting provider. They paid about $1 million in bitcoins.
That's right. Okay, yeah, that's for the reminder that, yeah, that's true. But somewhere, let me touch a little bit on that. It happens quite a bit. I have a client that paid $2 million for, I can't name the name obviously, but it's a municipal government client here in the US. They paid some money for ransomware attack, and it was very painful, very, very painful. But that can happen. And, now the hospitals are the prime target. Yeah, electronic health records, that's the prime target. There's actually a company out there who hackers, all they do is compromise healthcare records, electronic healthcare records. And unfortunately, the healthcare institutions are not that mature, so they're always in the news for security breaches. And most of them don't have CISOs. Most of them don't have mature security functions. And the reason is simple. I mean, if you talk to the average nurse or doctor, their number one priority is the patient. So all the administrative stuff that happens in terms of caring for a patient is not something that they pay a whole lot of attention to. But the unfortunate thing is we're in the information age, we're in the digital transformation age. You have devices, that are now in the Internet of Things. We have radiology type machines that are now smart and can take information and transmit information to the cloud and connect to EHR, hospital, systems and stuff like that. You have lab equipment that, measures stuff and then automatically reports the data elsewhere using internet technology and so on and so forth. Doctors don't really care a whole lot about that, but they use it. And so one problem there is the manufacturers of these tools, they're just in the business to make money, be innovative about these equipment and make money. And so security is not really on their minds, right? Until something happens and then a device is compromised, and then suddenly you don't have the information you need to care for a patient, and touch wood, the patient dies. That's colossal for a healthcare provider. It's so crazy, and you can't afford that. So it's a big problem with the healthcare institutions in terms of the devices that they're using, the intelligent internet-enabled devices they're using today, and how that influences care to a patient in a hospital. So just some examples there, but it goes to show how the digital transformation that we're going through is going to shape how data is managed and transacted all over the world, whether you're a patient or a doctor, an engineer, a board member, or just a guy who cleans the bathrooms in a company, really.
Being mindful of the time would go to our next question. Of course, data security is what we're discussing tonight. Thanks to Mr. Adeyobo, who is an expert in these 7. He's been working with various best companies both in Africa and in Europe, including Canada, for the last 20 years plus. So we're taking a lot of information from him, trying to understand this area of business and how it affects us. Thanks to Mr. Alf as well. Alf is, he works with NASA. Alf, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do? Because your background is also in IT, please.
Actually, my background is not in IT. My background is in systems engineering,
okay,
and acoustic consultancy. But I do work with computers quite a lot in configuration of computers and access to data, which we use to, which you guys use more than I do, but everybody uses in terms of, at the moment, weather and climate data. We use the satellites to collect the data, process the data, and disseminate the data for further on third parties to actually give you your weather forecasts and stuff like that, and what the climate is going to be and why climate changes, and people and organizations and governments use that data to determine whether it's too foggy, it's the air quality control, how much pollution the vehicles are making and stuff like that. So that is generally what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah. So here on Business Links, we are very, very lucky to have all these gentlemen as members within our group who are happy and prepared to give us answers to questions in various industries because of their industry backgrounds and their expertise in these areas. Our next question, which I think is a very general question, but it covers a lot of what we've just discussed, but it's from one of our members, so it has to be asked. And the question is, what major challenges are faced by CISOs in today's digitized economies? And that's
the challenges are many, but I would touch on maybe a handful. So one of them obviously is understanding the business in which they operate, right? So you might have security skills, governance skills, technical skills, etc. But the dynamics in a bank is very different from the dynamics in a healthcare provider institution, such as a hospital, or very different from an equipment manufacturer, right? So having that business know-how is very, very important, and it's one of the challenges that CISOs face. They have good technical skills, but don't have so good business skills and understanding business and interpreting technical issues in business terms. So that's one. Another one that I see out there is again, misunderstanding of the value and sensitivity of information, right? A lot of companies have lots of information, but they can't tell you. They can tell you what's important, but they can't tell you which one creates the most risk for the organization, because they don't understand the impacts of a compromise to that type of information. So that's one challenge that CISOs have when they are, when they try to build security programs or strategies to secure data. And frankly, if you don't know the value of the information you have, how can you be sure that you're actually protecting it? The other big thing I would say is on the user side, which relates to user awareness and training, right? A lot of companies, they'll tell you they do user awareness and training, but really what they do is they get an online program, training program, and ask everybody in the organization to take it, right? And then they think they've done awareness and training. No, 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 no. The reality is the security responsibilities of an executive is not the same as that of a line manager, not the same as that of a field operator, not the same as that of a janitor. So you ask anybody to take the same training, you're not providing any value to the organization. Instead, the right thing to do is to understand, first of all, the value of information in the environment, understand the roles and responsibilities by job position or by job role, and what the security responsibilities are to that job, right? So if you're an engineer and you're a design engineer and you design, intelligence systems, are you aware of the security responsibilities around that kind of a design? that you do. You know, if you're a marketing person and you are into, you know, business intelligence and you know, pulling marketing information and things like that, working with a lot of data, do you understand the data that you're dealing with and the security responsibilities around that? It's only by knowing that you can determine the appropriate security training and awareness to provide for that person to then to get some value from the work you're doing and the possibility or not of being compromised, right? So that's another key thing. The next thing I would mention is there's usually not a good interaction between the C-suite and the board with the rest of the organization, particularly on the IT side, in terms of the, you know, visibility of risks, right? So I can't tell you how many times as a consultant I've been in meetings with clients where the CIO is talking about is asking for money to go make an investment for security purposes, and everything he's talking about is so technical. The board members are sitting there asking, what in the world is he talking about? Because so they don't understand, right? And because they don't understand, they can't give him support because it's like these guys, they just spend money and we still get breached anyway. So it's one of the big challenges that CISOs face, to be able to interpret security issues, you know, or technology risk issues in business terms, so that they can get adequate support from C-suite and board to then make the appropriate investments to protect data. And then the other thing, frankly, is, you know, maybe last thing I'll mention is too much emphasis on technology, on tools, right? So somebody gets breached and then they're buying a tool straight away. But maybe the source of the breach was some guy in the operations that just clicked on some email link. Well, have you forgotten about the awareness and training you have to give to that person? Instead, you buy a tool. Well, guess what? He's going to open another hole elsewhere and somebody's going to compromise that again, right? So it's very important that, you know, the tools are not the answer to effective security. They play a role, yes, but you want to look at all the other pieces, which includes, you know, the people, the processes around that, you know, and then the third parties that provide services to the organization. You have to look at it holistically. That's the best chance for having any sort of success with you know, with a CISO's job. So those are what I would mention, but there are several issues out there in addition to what I just mentioned.
Excellent. Thanks so much for this explanation. It's covered a lot of the questions that we initially had. Hence, we're going to go to our final question. Does the Cisco, does the CISO sit on the board of directors?
Generally, no. It's very rare, very rare. However, CISOs often present or provide briefings to board members on the state of security and risk management, you know, from the IT side, and that actually happens for the enterprises that are a little bit more mature, you know, in terms of, you know, security, governance, risk compliance, and resilience. You have a whole lot of companies in the mid markets that don't even have a CISO, let alone someone that has some sort of interaction with the board. And that's where there's the most opportunity to make things work from a security perspective. It's not, you know, probably you don't find CISOs generally on the board, but there are maybe one or two cases that I know where the CISO has a role on the board because it's such a big global organization with lots of dependence on information, with lots of sensitive information items that require someone with a good CISO to be a part of. And in those situations, they've had that person on the board to share those perspectives as necessary. But it's a very rare occurrence to have a CISO on the board.
Excellent. That's obviously a good answer to our last question. Thank you so much, Mr. Adeyobo, for your time and efforts in answering all the questions that we've put forward to you. Thanks also to our audience. Thanks to Alf, who has been a very good moderator for us tonight. And thanks to all our viewers. Hopefully you'll be joining us in our successive sessions, which will be coming every fortnight. We'll have a short break over the Christmas period, but we'll keep you informed of all the events, including the sessions that we'll be holding on Business Links Africa. It's been such an informative session for me tonight, and I believe to all our viewers as well. Do you have any questions to add, Alf, before we close the session?
No, just to thank Michael. Thanks for taking up your time. And apologies to all those. It's gone a little bit over time. It was supposed to be just over an hour, but we've done more than an hour. I think we've almost approached an hour and a half, 2 hours. So apologies for being late. There were one or two technical problems again. But all in all, I think it was a good session. And thank you again, Michael, in the States. Some of us are about to go to bed. You're about to have a good afternoon. So good afternoon, and thanks for all the guys there that have listened in and participated with your questions, and thanks for the answers.
Excellent. Excellent. Michael, do you have any closing statement, anything to tell us, advise us, especially those of us in Ghana, in Africa, our companies, our businesses? What's your generally overall thoughts, at least the least that we can do to ensure that we don't have any security breaches with our systems?
So, I mean, I would say that the takeaway is understand the value of the information you have, and what you do with that information, access to it, etc., and pay attention to those ones that are mostly sensitive and that could have impacts on your businesses and what you do on a day-to-day basis, and take the steps necessary to secure them. And when I say secure them, I don't mean just technology. Look at it from the people perspective, look at it from the process perspective, set a bar, and aspire to that bar, chase it relentlessly, because security is such a hot topic right now, particularly as we enter the digital transformation age, and it's not going away anytime soon. So it's imperative that we all pay some attention to the security of what we generally take for granted. It could be business information, or it could be something as simple as, you know, what we text and forward and so on our mobile devices and so on and so forth. We need to pay attention to those. And I think the more we do that, the best chance we have to ensure we are working in a secure environment overall.
Excellent. That actually brings me to a last question, because I use my mobile phone quite a lot. I use it for banking transactions, and not only national, as in terms of using them within the UK, but I also do international transactions. What's your advice to a person like myself, who uses his mobile device to deal with or do transactions with several banks and building businesses elsewhere in different countries?
And if I just extend that question actually to add these, because people use their mobile phones and tablets and mobile devices on public and free Wi-Fi hotspots, which is again another, I think, falls directly under this question.
Sure. So some basics, right? So if your mobile device is not encrypted, I will strongly recommend that you encrypt it. If you go into your settings, under the security settings, you have an option there that allows you to encrypt your phone. The other thing I would say is pay attention to what you send out and what you receive, and the sensitivity around that. And you know, if you don't have to sacrifice efficiency let me choose my words carefully. You don't want to sacrifice efficiency that much, but security is important because it makes nonsense of efficiency, really. So do the things that you think you're comfortable with from a security perspective doing on your phone. Otherwise, don't do it. Will be one advice that I'll give. And then just be careful with how you handle the phone. Be careful what apps you download. Be careful with pretty much everything you do on the phone, and also pay attention to where your information goes. You can use, like those of us that use Samsung phones. I know, for example, the Samsung Note 9 has a Samsung Health app where you can measure things like your oxygen, blood oxygen levels, and heart rates and things like that. This is personal health information. It's regulated data. Do you know where that data goes? You want to pay attention to some of those things and ask questions. And the other thing I would mention is every time you sign on or you register an app, there is this end user license agreement and other fine prints that probably 98% of us don't pay enough attention to. Read it, because somewhere in there, they'll tell you what your responsibilities are and what you're going to do with your data and so on and so forth. Just make sure you've read it and you're comfortable with it before you sign up. And if you don't have a choice, then take other measures around your device, around your phone, around your transactions to make sure that you are at least security aware of what you're doing on those. But at the minimum, encrypt your phone and put some sort of threat management solution on there. Norton has a good one that I personally use. So yeah, you can use that. There are several other ones that you can download from the App Store, or and so on. So yeah, those would be my recommendations.
Does that apply to Apple phones as well? Because I know Apple phones are slightly very what do you call it, security conscious.
I think everybody tries to be security conscious, but yours, is all about. Apple has a fairly good reputation from a security standpoint, but I've seen Apple phones or Apple devices, MacBooks and stuff, show some weird stuff. So it can happen, but it's not. By and large, mobile phones is a little bit more difficult, but you're always good if you have some sort of additional protection beyond what the operating system, in this case iOS or Android, offers, because they have built-in stuff. But there are those who argue that they like Apple better and so on, because you don't hear a whole lot about that. That's all good, but it can happen, and I've seen it. So don't assume, don't just take the word for it. Be conscious of what you do with those devices and how secure it is what I would say.
Okay.
VPNs.
Yeah, one last question, which was about the elections in Ghana. I've always wondered, I don't know if you have any background information on that, but apparently there was security breaches that was overcome during the elections.
It was?
In terms of how the balloting, or how the, during the, what should I say, where people were sending their votes, which helped so that the system wasn't rigged. Is there a possibility these things can happen?
Yeah, absolutely. It's when you look at the voting process and the election process overall, there are underlying business processes that support that. There are underlying tools. There's underlying technologies. There are people with various roles, and there's always a weak link somewhere. That's the problem. This is a problem that all businesses face. So we hope that whoever has accountability for security in that kind of environment is aware of where the weak points are, where the sources of risks are in each one of those areas, and take measures to protect against risks before actually going through an election. The challenge is always how effective is that done? You know, how effectively do the people in charge of security do that? You're as good as the skills, competence, and you know, and strategic thinking of the person that has such an accountability, really. But anywhere you have information and sensitive information, like a vote, somebody's vote, you can be sure there's a bad actor somewhere that's trying to get at it and to do something with it. So awareness of that alone is a good prerequisite to putting in appropriate security controls to make sure potential rigging and misplaced votes and things like that don't happen, really.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. Sorry for taking over so much of your time. We're conscious that, of course, we have gone over the 2-hour period. So we'll end here, unless there's any other questions or any comments or any advice that you'd like to give. The ball is in your hands.
Yeah, but final message will be security conscious in everything that you do. Really, that's the biggest takeaway for everyone. Be security conscious at home, at work, out on the park, driving, whatever. Be security conscious, and I think life will be better for all of us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So to our viewers, to Business Links members, and to everyone, have a good evening, and thank you so much for joining. Hopefully we'll see you in our next session. Adios.